Before we begin, just take a moment to your savior. There's nothing you need to do, nowhere you need to go, just let your body relax, let your thoughts slow down, and if you enjoy these quiet stories, you can gently support the channel with a like. It helps more than you think now, just let go and allow the story to carry you whenever you're ready, just listen. Frozen future. Cryonics in the search for immortality. Will the bodies waiting in liquid nitrogen ever wake up? Part 1 of the last ambulance to the future. There are some dreams humanity has never been able to let go of. To heal every disease. To outrun old age. To keep love from ending. To refuse the final insult of time. Cryonics was born from that refusal. Not from religion. Not from myth. Not from ancient magic. But from a colder idea. What if death, at least in some cases, is not a wall, but a timing problem? Today, cryonics exists not as mainstream medicine, but as a controversial, deeply speculative practice built around one wager that a person declared legally dead might still be preserved well enough for some future civilization to repair what medicine today cannot. Modern cryonics organizations openly state that this is not reversible with current technology. Alka says plainly that no cryonics organization can currently revive a cryopreserved patient, and both Alka and Britannica describe the process as beginning only after legal death, followed by cooling, perfusion with cryoprotective chemicals, and long-term storage in liquid nitrogen around 196 degrees C. That is what makes cryonics so eerie. It does not promise life now. It promises a chance later. A body is declared dead. The heart has stopped. The lore has spoken. Family members grieve in the present tense. And then, almost immediately, another logic begins. Ice packs. Shrine support. Blood circulation support, if possible. Cryoprotectants moving through vessels. A descent into deep cold. Then the lumps leap inside a vacuum-insulated metal door, fed by liquid nitrogen, waiting for a future that may never come. This is why cryonics feels less like a medical procedure and more like a scene from a civilization that has not fully arrived yet. The person is legally dead, but the organization caring for them often does not want to describe them as a hopeless corpse. The language shifts. The patient, long-term care, the cryopreserved. It is an effort to hold open a philosophical door that modern medicine has already closed. The Cryonics Institute explicitly frames cryopreserved people as patients in suspended time rather than inevitably dead remains, while also admitting that cryopreservation is not suspended animation in the reversible sense known to current science. Imagine walking into such a facility for the first time. Still, quiet, the breathless sterility of low temperature. Rows of jewels standing upright like silent sentries. Names attached to futures that have been postponed instead of accepted. To the outside world, it may look absurd. To the people who paid for it, it may look like the last possible act of hope. And hope, when aimed at death, always becomes a little frightening. The modern cryonics movement is usually traced back to Robert Ettinger, whose book The Prospect of Immortality first appeared in 1962 and was formally published in 1964. Britannica identifies Ettinger as the figure who popularized cryonics and later became known as its father. The first human widely recognized as cryonically preserved was James Bedford, who was placed into preservation on January 12, 1967, after dying of cancer. Bedford's case became the founding legend of the movement, and both Britannica and cryonics organizations still point to him as the earliest human example of long-term cryonic care. There is something haunting about Bedford's place in this story. He did not enter the future through a rocket. He entered it through cancer, urgency, and dry ice. Britannica notes that his preservation happened before all arrangements had been fully completed, meaning his blood was not properly drained first in the way later cryonics advocates would have preferred. He was injected with cryoprotective agents, packed in dry ice, then eventually transferred into liquid nitrogen storage. Decades later, cryonics organizations still refer to him as a patient in care, not as a failed historical curiosity. That detail matters, because cryonics does not really live on proof. It lives on continuity. As long as the body remains preserved, the argument remains alive too. Maybe not scientifically proven, maybe not medically respectable in the mainstream sense, but not fully buried either. And over time, what began as a fringe dream did not disappear. It remained small, but real. Britannica reported that by 2023 about 500 people had been cryonically preserved worldwide, most of them in the United States, while Alka's own 2025 history page says it had grown to 1,500 plus members and 230 plus patients. That does not make cryonics validated science, but it does mean this is not merely a cinematic fantasy. It is an organized subculture with facilities, funding structures, legal preparations, patient care trusts, and a belief system built around future rescue. The process itself sounds clinical until you remember what it is actually trying to do. Cryonics begins after legal death because medicine has already failed to keep the person alive in the ordinary sense. From there, the goal is not to resurrect them now, but to reduce further destruction. Britannica describes the body being packed in ice and then perfused with cryoprotective agents. Alka says those compounds are introduced to reduce or even prevent freezing damage to blood vessels, the brain, and other organs before the patient is cooled to 196 degrees C and placed into long-term care. The word vitrification becomes central here. Instead of allowing tissue water to form destructive ice crystals, the system aims to create a glass-like state. That word of vitrification is one of the most important in the entire cryonic story, because ordinary freezing is brutal. Ice crystals puncture cells. They distort tissue. They destroy delicate structure. If cryonics were nothing more than freeze the body and hope, the idea would collapse almost immediately under its own damage. Vitrification is the reason the movement can still speak in the language of possibility. It is an attempt to avoid crystallization and lock tissues into an ice-free glassy state instead. Reviews of modern cryopreservation explain that vitrification has become one of the field's most promising strategies precisely because ordinary ice formation is such a major source of injury, especially in larger and more complex tissues. But now the nightmare becomes more subtle, because avoiding ice is not enough. Even the broader field of cryobiology, far more mainstream than cryonics, still struggles with preserving large tissues and organs. A 2024 review of tissue and organ cryopreservation notes major remaining challenges including ice crystal formation, cryoprotectant toxicity, and the difficulty of preserving large complex organs. The same review said effective methods for organs beyond short preservation windows are still not in routine clinical practice, and that hearts and kidneys have not been consistently recovered after cooling to very low temperatures. So picture the real situation. A whole human body is far harder than an organ. A brain is not just an organ, but a library of identity. And cryonics is being attempted only after legal death, when ischemic injury may already have begun. The body can be cooled. The chemistry can be slowed. Physical decay can be greatly reduced. But reduction is not reversal. This is the central tension of cryonics. The procedure may preserve something, but no one can currently prove it preserves enough. That is why the most serious cryonics arguments often shift away from the whole body and toward the brain. Britannica notes that some people choose neuropreservation, preserving only the head, because they believe future technology might restore or re-embody the person if the information-bearing structures of the brain survive. A 2024 review on structural brain preservation pushes the argument further, suggesting that if the organization of the brain truly encodes personality and long-term memory, then preserving enough of that structure might act as a bridge to future repair, though the same review emphasizes that this has never been proven in humans and remains experimental, uncertain, and philosophically contested. This is where cryonics stops being just a technological gamble and becomes something more intimate, because the real question is not where the flesh can be chilled. It is whether you can be carried through the cold, not your skin, not your fingerprints, not your DNA alone, your memories, your voice, your fears, the private arrangement of the self. If that arrangement is lost, then what wakes up, if anything ever does, may not be you at all. And that possibility gives cryonics its strange emotional gravity. It is not a crude fantasy of freezing meat. It is an argument about information, continuity, and personal identity disguised as a medical service. The 2024 Brain Preservation Review says openly that long-term suspended animation is not yet possible, that whole organs like the heart or brain cannot yet be reversibly cryopreserved, and that even experimental brain preservation is only a best effort attempt to maintain structures thought to underlie memory and personality. In other words, the scientific version of the cryonics argument is not "we know this works." It is "we do not know enough to say there is no chance." That is a much colder kind of hope, not certainty, not even probability in the everyday sense. A narrow crack left open against finality, and the people who choose cryonics know, at least in principle, what kind of bargain they are making. Cryonics organizations themselves acknowledge uncertainty. The Cryonics Institute says it cannot guarantee success, cannot guarantee the future, and openly frames revival as dependent on scientific advances that do not exist yet. Alka likewise says revival is not currently possible and places its hope in future nanotechnology and advanced medicine. Even the advocates, in their most candid language, are not selling resurrection on demand. They are selling an improbable continuation of possibility. Yet that improbable possibility is enough for some people to sign the papers, enough to arrange funding through life insurance, enough to plan emergency contact chains, enough to make their final medical event also the beginning of a technical procedure, enough to imagine the ambulance not as a ride to a hospital, but as the last vehicle to the future. That image is what gives cryonics its enduring cultural power. It is half science, half wager, half defines too many halves, perhaps, which is exactly why it feels unreal. You do not choose cryonics because evidence has already delivered immortality. You choose it because burial and cremation feel like the acceptance of total erasure, and cryonics, however speculative, it offers a tiny surviving alternative. Not a promise. A postponement of the verdict. By now, the movement has accumulated rituals, institutions, and legends. James Bedford remains its patron ghost, the first man still waiting. Alka's history page says it assumed Bedford's long-term care in 1987 after his body had been under family supervision and other organizations for years. That same page frames later advances in brain vitrification, standby services, imaging, and long-term funding as steps toward improving preservation quality, even while the central barrier remains untouched. No cryonics patient has ever been revived. And that is where part 1 ends. Not with a miracle, not with a resurrection chamber, not with a body opening its eyes beneath blue laboratory lights, but with a colder and more unsettling image, a legally dead person, rushed into ice. Cryoprotectants moving where blood once moved. A descent toward 196 degrees C. A steel drawer filling with liquid nitrogen. And inside it, a human life transformed into a question for a century that does not yet exist. Part 2, if the sleeper ever returns, the hardest part of cryonics is not the freezing. It is the waking. That is where the dream becomes almost unbearable because it forces two separate questions into the same room. Can a body be preserved well enough to repair later? And even if it can, would the person who wakes still be the same person who went in? Science does not currently answer either question with confidence. The strongest mainstream position remains that long-term reversible suspended animation of large organs, let alone whole human bodies, is not yet possible. A 2024 review on structural brain preservation says this directly: reversible suspended animation has not been achieved for large organs such as the heart or brain, let alone an entire body, and the cryobiology community remains skeptical for exactly that reason. A separate 2024 review of tissue and organ cryopreservation likewise emphasizes that larger organs still face major barriers from ice formation, toxicity, and warming damage, and yet the dream survives because the science has not stood completely still. In cryobiology, the legitimate scientific field from which cryonics borrows many of its concepts, there has been genuine progress. In 2023, a Nature Communications paper showed that rat kidneys could be vitrified, stored cryogenically for up to 100 days, then nano-warmed, transplanted, and provide life-sustaining kidney function in effectomized rats. The authors were careful about the limits. It was a rat model, storage was finite, and longer follow-up was still needed. But it was still a real milestone. Not whole body revival, not human reanimation, but proof that cryogenic organ banking is not pure fantasy at smaller scales. That matters because cryonics has always fed on adjacent progress. A frozen embryo becomes healthy development. A cryopreserved sperm sample becomes a child. An organ bank becomes slightly more plausible. A vitrified kidney survives. Each step is small, local, and nowhere near human immortality. But each step prevents the larger dream from dying outright. And in 2026, another development pushed the emotional boundary a little further. Reporting on a new PNAS study described researchers in Germany restoring some functional activity in vitrified mouse brain tissue after storage at deep cryogenic temperatures. Scientific American, summarizing the work, reported that mouse hippocampal slices preserved in a glass-like state and rewarmed later showed near normal electrical responses, intact membranes, and long-term potentiation, a process linked to learning and memory. The researchers also extended the method to whole mouse brains in situ, though only slices from those brains were later tested, and the work remained far from preserving or restoring a living animal mind. This is the sort of result that can mislead people if told carelessly, because it sounds like science fiction becoming real. And in a narrow sense it is, but only in a narrow sense. No mouse was put to sleep for a century and awakened. No memories were recovered from a cryopreserved living brain as lived experience. No whole conscious animal returned from deep cryogenic storage. What the study showed was that some brain tissue function could survive vitrification and rewarming better than many people assumed. It is a remarkable advance in cryobiology. It is not a human cryonics breakthrough. Even the researchers and outside experts quoted in the article said large organs in mammals remain far beyond current capabilities, with major obstacles involving heat transfer, cryoprotectant toxicity, and mechanical stresses that can crack tissue during cooling or rewarming. And that is where the real terror of cryonics begins, because the obstacles are not just to keep it cold. They are layered. First comes the problem of ischemia, the damage that begins when oxygen stops flowing after cardiac arrest. Then comes the challenge of moving cryoprotective chemicals uniformly through the body or brain. Then the problem of toxicity from the same chemicals. Then the need to cool without forming destructive ice. Then the equally brutal need to rewarm without cracks, vitrification, or thermal stress. Then, beyond all that, the impossible seeming requirement of repairing whatever damage already existed from disease, aging, death, preservation, and time. In other words, even if you preserve the patient well, revival would still require a civilization capable of doing things medicine cannot remotely do today. Repairing global cellular damage, repairing vascular injury, repairing molecular and structural disruption in the brain, curing the disease that killed the person in the first place, and perhaps reversing age itself. Cryonics organizations know this, which is why their rhetoric so often leans on future technologies like nanotechnology, tissue engineering, advanced regeneration, or entirely new repair paradigms. The Cryonics Institute explicitly says its case depends not on current reversibility but on future molecular repair capabilities, while ALCO likewise places its hope in future nanotechnology and broad medical advances. That is the scientific gamble. But the philosophical gamble may be even worse, because let us imagine, for a moment, that the impossible engineering problems are solved. Suppose a body could be rewarmed without cracking. Suppose toxic damage could be repaired. Suppose neural structures could be reconstructed. Suppose the cancer, stroke, trauma, or age-related failure that killed the patient could be cured. Suppose the machine opens, the sleeper breathes, the heart beats again. Who has actually returned? The 2024 review on structural brain preservation centers this exact problem. The brain matters because it carries the continuity of memory, belief, personality, and the psychological traits that define identity. But the same paper also admits we still do not fully know which exact structural correlates are necessary to preserve those traits, or how much damage can be tolerated before the information content required for personal identity is gone. In plain language, even if future engineers can build a functioning human, science today cannot guarantee they are restoring the same self rather than creating an approximation from damaged remains. That possibility should haunt anyone drawn to cryonics, because the movement speaks in the language of survival, but survival is not just the return of metabolism. It is the return of the person, your childhood memories, your private fears, the way your mind reaches for certain words, the shape of your grief, the continuity only you experience from the inside. If that continuity is broken, then waking up may not be victory. It may be a replacement. Cryonics advocates often answer this by shifting from certainty to information theory. If enough of the brain structure survives, perhaps future technologies can infer and restore what matters. The 2024 review does make a version of the argument, saying current preservation might, in principle, act as a bridge to future repair, and that degrees of survival may be possible rather than an all or nothing boundary. But the same paper is explicit that this remains experimental and uncertain, not demonstrated human rescue. It is a philosophical opening, not a solved neuroscientific fact. And this is where the title's final question becomes unbearable. Will the bodies waiting in liquid nitrogen ever wake up? A careful answer today has to be, maybe not. Maybe never. And maybe some version of waking will arrive that does not mean what we think it means. The best evidence for cautious optimism comes from neighbouring fields, not from cryonics itself. Rat kidney surviving vitrification and nanowarming show that the organs can sometimes be recovered after deep cryogenic storage under very specific conditions. Mouse brain slices recovering electrical function show that delicate neural tissue may survive vitrification more successfully than older intuitions suggested. Reviews of cryopreservation point to real progress in cells, embryos, ovarian tissue, and some experimental tissues. But the same literature is equally clear that whole large organ reversible cryopreservation remains unsolved, and that scaling these methods to human-sized organs or entire bodies remains a completely different class of challenge. So cryonics sits in a disturbing place between two truths. The first truth is that mainstream medicine cannot do what cryonics hopes for. The second truth is that mainstream science has advanced just enough to keep the hope from collapsing entirely. That in-between state is why cryonics still attracts both ridicule and serious philosophical attention. It is easy to laugh at the image of bodies in liquid nitrogen dreaming of future centuries. It is harder to dismiss once you admit that information, structure, and reversible biostasis are real scientific topics, even if cryonics itself remains radically unproven. The 2024 Brain Preservation Review explicitly argues that experimental brain preservation deserves serious research attention, while also acknowledging that its authors include people affiliated with preservation organizations and that the field still faces enormous uncertainty. That combination of scientific seriousness with that scientific closure is exactly what makes cryonics culturally radioactive. It is not only a technical story, it is a moral one. What obligations do the living owe to the frozen? If a cryonics facility fails decades from now, has it merely mishandled remains or destroyed persons in waiting? If future medicine can restore only partial memory or damaged personality, is revival an act of rescue or a new form of suffering? If the future can wake you but not your spouse, or your child, or anyone else you loved, what sort of immortality is that? Cryonics promises continuation, but it says very little about loneliness. Picture a sleeper who actually returns after a century. The language has changed. The nation that froze them may not exist anymore. Everyone they knew is gone. Their money, if any remains, belongs to a world with other values. Their body may be restored, but their past is unrecoverable except as archive. Would that be life? Yes. Would it be salvation? Not necessarily. And still people sign the forms, because the alternative, ordinary death, feels too absolute. That is the emotional engine of cryonics. Not confidence, not proof, not established medicine. It is the refusal to accept that burial, cremation, and disappearance are the only options modern civilization can offer. Cryonics transforms that refusal into a practical ritual. Legal paperwork, standby teams, liquid nitrogen, long-term trust funds, and the hope that future science may someday look back at us the way we look back at eras that once considered infection, organ failure, or cardiac arrest final. Maybe that hope is tragic. Maybe it is visionary. Maybe it is both. Because cryonics is ultimately not a story about frozen bodies. It is a story about how badly human beings want one more chance, one more century, one more dawn, one more conversation not cut short by a disease. One more era in which medicine is smarter than the one that failed us. Science, as of now, does not say that cryonics works. It does not say human beings in liquid nitrogen will wake. It says something much colder and less cinematic. Certain tissues and organs can sometimes be preserved better than they once could. Vitrification can avoid some forms of damage. Rewarming remains a severe challenge. Whole body reversible preservation is far beyond present capability. And the question of preserving identity is still unresolved even in theory. But stories do not survive on certainty alone. Sometimes they survive on unfinished science. On a steel chamber no one has opened. On a first patient from 1967 still waiting in cold suspension. On a kidney that survived 100 frozen days in a rat. On mouse brain tissue that, after deep freezing, still remembered how to fire. On the suspicion that death may not be a single moment, but a gradual collapse of recoverable structure. And that is where the story ends. Not with immortality, not with failure, not with proof one way or the other, but with a room somewhere in the desert, or in Michigan, or in another facility built for patients. A drawer humming in silence. Liquid nitrogen holding the line against decay. My name attached to a body the law calls dead and its caretakers call a patient. And above that frozen stillness, the question that has not gone away since cryonics began. Is this a grave postponed, or the longest medical emergency in human history?